Well, today we're going to open our Bibles to the 14th chapter of this wonderful book of Revelation. And chapter 15 is very small, so the Lord willing, we'll go through chapter 14 and 15 today. And just so that we know where we are, does everybody have the handout? It takes more and more room at the top of the page. Does anybody need one? Raise your hand, maybe. I kind of gray out the area that we've already covered, but I think it's important to realize how this next part fits in with what we've done so far. So ever since 1C on the grayed out part of our outline, we've been in the tribulation. And we saw the opening of the 7 seals, and then the sounding of the 7 trumpets. And then we considered some important matters during the period. This is a sort of a parenthetical part. And then last week, we looked at the reign of the unholy Trinity and the mark of the beast. And by the way, somebody asked, how do we find videos if we miss them? Maybe not everybody knows how to get to my page. I should say it more often. The easiest way is just to Google Prophecy Central. Because my site comes up first after the advertisements and stuff like that. And Prophecy Central actually has a different URL. The URL is bible-prophecy.com. But you can find it easier by remembering Prophecy Central. And once you get on the page, the left-hand column is pretty much devoted to our videos. There's a picture of me teaching here, and then there's a list of chapter 1, 2, 3, and so on. And so you can go down to the one you want. It also allows you to download whatever handouts or resources that we have. So if you get behind, or if you want to share it with somebody else, tell them to do that. And the materials are there and the videos are there. They're also on YouTube. You can just YouTube find it easily too. Okay, we come now to the 14th chapter and point 3E in our outline, which is the redemption of the 144,000 during the tribulation. Now, you remember the 144,000 because we studied them already in chapter 7. And not too much was said about them at that time except that they were sealed and that they were comprised of 12,000 people from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then we looked at the fact that the 12 tribes of Israel kind of changed the name a little bit depending on what period of history you're in. And right now, only God knows who belongs to which tribe of Israel. But God is the one that's going to make the choice of these people, and this passage will tell us a little bit more about them and what they do. So let's read chapter 14, verses 1 to 5. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. We're going to come back to this. And with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. We'll come back to that. And I heard the sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like the harpists playing their harps, and they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remained virgins. They followed the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as firstfruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. Now that's a lot of new information about them, isn't it? So let's go back over some of the details. First of all, the first thing he saw was the Lamb. And who is the Lamb? Jesus. Chapter 1, chapter 5 of Revelation we've already studied. John said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. I give you those scriptures in there. He was our Passover. I didn't put scriptures in for that, but the Passover was all about sacrificing a lamb so that God would pass over those who had the blood on the doorposts. And Jesus' crucifixion was on the Passover. He is our Passover. He is the sacrificed lamb. And we find the epistles also referring to him in that way. But here's the interesting part in context of what we're doing. the Lamb is standing on Mount Zion, and with him the 144,000. So my question is, the first thing that I wondered about, and I'm not exactly sure of the right answer right now, but I'll give you possibilities. Is this Mount Zion up right there at Jerusalem? That's another name for Jerusalem, is Mount Zion. There's 3 great mountains at Jerusalem. And Mount Zion is the holy hill, the holy mountain. And is he talking about the physical Mount Zion that you could still go to today and visit? Or is this a heavenly Mount Zion? Because where's Jesus? He ascended into heaven, right? But, and I never thought about this until I worked with my dear friend that I only met in person once, but became close brothers with on the internet, Lambert Dolphin. Lambert Dolphin was a physics professor and a very intelligent guy. He retired early because he'd rather teach the Bible. So he has Lambert Dolphin's library on the internet. It's just full of great stuff. Anyway, he introduced me to the idea that Jesus, even though he ascended into heaven, he's still here. But why not? He's God. He could be everywhere, right? And when he gave the Great Commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel, what was the big consoling factor? He said in Matthew 28:20, I think, and behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. Sure. So some of you have probably had experiences in your life where it seemed like Jesus just appeared to you. Maybe it seemed like a dream or a vision, or maybe you just felt his presence. That's what I mostly get. I believe the Lord is with me always. We can walk and talk. That's what our prayer life is about. I don't have to think of him as being so far away until he finally comes back, because he is there at the right hand of the Father, but he also, because he's God, he's still here with us. And that's why he appears to some of Muslims, and some in a dream and some in something else, a trance or something. That's why a lot of stories in the world include Jesus appearing. And I believe that he is here with us. And I believe this was probably the physical Mount Zion that John was seeing in the vision, and that the 144,000 hadn't died and gone to heaven because it's not time yet.
Pastor Ron, if we have him in our hearts, he is living in us.
Yeah.
And if he's living in us, he's here.
Yeah. You ask him into your life.
Yeah. And he comes into your life.
Yeah. Do you take that literally? I sure do.
Take it literally.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we are blessed with all spiritual blessings in heavenly places, in Ephesians. So we have everything, access to everything of
Yeah. Well, here's another interesting thing that we learned about the 144,000. I read it in verse 2, or is it still part of verse 1? I think it is. That the Jesus' name and the Father's name are written on their foreheads. Chapter 7, we learned that they were sealed. But now we see that the seal is probably a physical naming of Jesus and the Father on their foreheads. What does that remind you of in the book of Revelation? Previous chapter, Mark of the Beast, is the name or the number of Antichrist. And by the way, I realized after I taught this, I didn't really bear down on this, and it's so important. That number that people receive in chapter 13, the Mark of the Beast, is not their number. Their number may be implanted in a chip or something like that. But this is Antichrist's number, or his name. So you can say, no, just put his whole beautiful name on there. I worship him. Or at least put his number, because I have to show that I worship him. It's about worship. You wear a cross to show the world that you worship Jesus. Not everybody wears a cross, but when you do, that's pretty much the reason that you do it, okay? That you worship Jesus. So that Mark of the Beast in Revelation 13 is an act of worship imposed on them by the Antichrist and the false prophet, whether they really worship him or not. But once they've made that decision, they can never go back. We see that in this chapter also. So by contrast to that, now that he's spoken of the Mark of the Beast, he says these 144,000 also have a mark on their forehead. And what is it? It's Jesus' name and the Father's. It's Christianity, right? So this is exciting new information. And of course, being sealed, they are protected from being put to death. And then, when it talks in verse 2 about it, the sound like a rushing water and a loud peal of thunder, that takes us back in our thoughts too to chapter 1 as one of the descriptions of Jesus. And whenever I read these passages about the thunder and the loud rushing waters, I think of Niagara Falls. And I suppose there's other places in the world that are equally impressive, but our one time to see Niagara, we were dead tired. I won't tell that whole story, but we had so little time, but we were close enough to it. We needed to stop, and we needed to go to sleep. So we looked at it, and we were totally impressed, and then we said, okay, let's go. Because we were just so tired. But I would love to spend a week there, and never had heard that kind of a sound with my own ears. You can hear it on television, but it's different. And then it says that they sang a new song, and we see the new song in the book of Revelation in different places. We'll see it again at the end. And there was one, I think in chapter 5, but the words were given and the meaning was given. But this new song, it says they're the only ones that could sing it. And you know, there are several things in Revelation that show that there are certain things that are universal for all the believers or even all the non-believers or whatever. But there are certain things that are private just for you as the child of God. Like a new name written. We saw that in one of the churches. A new name will be written on a white stone. And nobody's going to know that except you and God. This is your pet name with God. So, but these, they have a song. It's their special song. Nobody else can even really get it. And these are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remained virgin. Most of the commentaries I've read on this have said they must be spiritual virgins. You know, they haven't corrupted themselves with bad doctrine. Okay, I'm sure that part's true. But why mention women then? Yeah. You know, in our generation, I mean, this, maybe it's part of what I told you a little while ago. The other people that are following in this tremendous new, maybe revival that's coming up, are not going to defile themselves. And women don't defile men. That's not what it's trying to say here, but I think it's saying they haven't had sex. And I think that's pretty amazing. You know, 144,000 of them. It shows how committed they are to the Lord Jesus Christ. And it also reminds me, though, of Paul's teaching in Corinthians, where he said, if you're not already married, don't do it right now. Because in this present time of persecution, it was understood, you're going to subject your wife and maybe your children, if you have children, to persecution, and it would be better if you could just remain the bride of Christ. So there are periods of time when the Lord approves celibacy over normal married life, but he doesn't condemn those who do get married. Paul didn't in Corinthians, and I'm sure during the tribulation, the Lord will not condemn those that are married or get married during the tribulation. But out of that mess, there's 144,000 people who don't have to report home at night because they're on mission for Jesus Christ all over the world, preaching the gospel with all the strength that they have, and don't have to have a regular job or support a regular family. See what I'm saying? To me, it makes total sense. They're talking about real virginity here. And as hard as that is to believe in our corrupt world, I saw a spark of that just this week, you know. So who knows what the Lord may be doing behind the scenes right now. Well, let's move on to the reports from heaven during the tribulation in verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, title, or tribe, rather, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water." And we're going to see what the other angels have to say after this. But these are 4 messages being delivered by 4 angels at this midpoint of the tribulation, right after the mark of the beast, right? So to get that picture, This is the only time in human history that angels have the privilege of preaching the gospel. And the book of Hebrews says they always wish they could be doing that. You know, they're so entranced with the story of human salvation, and we're so eager for people to know, but God has not given it to the angels until this point in future history to proclaim the gospel, because that's our privilege and responsibility. Does that make sense? And that's the only reason he leaves us here, by the way. I accepted the Lord when I was 13. I would have been glad to go to heaven right then and there. At any point along the line, even though I've enjoyed raising a family, marrying a wonderful person, having a great 50 years of pastorate and all of that, any point along that line, I've known it would be better to be in heaven with Jesus than to be here on earth doing his work, you know. But it was a privilege to do his work. And that was his will. And so the only reason he left us here, the point I was trying to get at, is to win other people to Christ. It isn't for our benefit. He left us here. Ultimately, it is the benefit of winning people to Christ, because we're going to end up in heaven anyway. But in the meanwhile, it's so fulfilling and so wonderful to be able to share the gospel. And the angels haven't had that privilege. But now, when there's hardly any born-again people out in the public square, it's too late. You know, the last Christians that let their face be seen in public, as people know that they're Christians, are going to be underground, or they're going to be put to death. And at that point, when people are trying to make up their mind whether or not to receive the mark of the beast, because this is a one-shot deal, and children, by the way, are not involved in that. You have to be able to make up your mind to worship Antichrist in order to get the mark. The children don't need to have buying and selling privileges. You know, but when they mature, during the next 3.5 years, some of them will mature, and at that point they'll have to make a decision to receive it or not. But here, in God's grace, and in the absence of human preachers, except for the 144,000, I'm sure they're helping a lot, the angels chime in, and they go around the whole earth, giving the gospel and warning people not to take the mark of the beast. Isn't that amazing? Our good God, all the power, all the different ways that he can do whatever needs to be done. So that was the first message. And the second message in verse 8, a second angel followed and said, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which has made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries." Babylon the Great. We've talked about Babylon before, and I'm going to save the rest of our discussion for chapters 17 and 18, because in those two chapters you have a lot about Babylon. The final world government and the final world religion are both spawned by Babylon, and we'll review that history and add to it when we get to chapters 17 and 18. But these angels are saying, even though now it looks like the Antichrist has reached his apex and can now impose economic dictatorship on the whole world, this is the beginning of the fall of Babylon, because God's going to bring them down. That's the message of the second angel. Then there's a message from the third angel in verse 9. The third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives his mark on their forehead and on their hand, they too will drink the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb." This is one of the saddest verses in the Bible. And yet it's in God's goodness that the angel's warning them about this. But what happens if you ignore God's final warning to you? If you ask the average person in the whole world, and I would dare say the average Christian today, they'll say, "I don't really believe in hell." Now, we're in a small segment of Christianity that still hangs on to that old belief, because it's in the Bible, and it's really strong right here. But people like Rob Bell and many other modern young pastors of megachurches, of mostly young people that don't want to hear bad news. And they don't get it from people like Ron Bell. They get good news about how they can improve their life, but this is the bad news, hell. And I wish it weren't true. And I'm not sure at all that we understand what hell is really going to be like. Somehow, I have to say by faith that God knows, and this may be hard for you to accept right now because I've wrestled with it for so many years. I believe strongly in a hell, a literal hell, because Jesus talked about it, and because of this place and many other places, I believe it's real. But I also believe that somehow it's just. And here's where I start with that. And I don't know if this helps you or not, but this is how I try to cope with it. The people that are going to go to hell don't really want to be with God. That's why they're not going to hell, whether they know what they're in for or not. And that is a starting point, because I believe that in God's grace, He's given them creation, He's given them a conscience, He's provided missionaries that would come to them if only they would be willing to hear. I know that God knows how to get the gospel to every single person in every single age that would respond. I think that's what the Bible teaches. And if they ultimately reject, like these people who have had all of the evidence that of what's good and what's bad, and they finally decide to worship the beast, they don't want to be with God. I've heard people say that for a person who's going to hell, their concept of hell is being cooped up with God in heaven.
No.
See what I'm saying? Where you can't do anything fun, you have to play harps and float in clouds. Now maybe they don't really think that out in their mind, but they have a choice many times during their life to follow God, which is totally logical and right, or to not follow God because they'd rather do something sinful instead. And when you get to heaven, you're not going to do anything sinful. And that doesn't appeal to these people.
And there'll be things to do.
There'll be things,
Just be
of
sitting
course.
around playing harps.
Oh my goodness. Heaven's going to be so amazing, you can't even tell us about it yet. That's what Paul said. You can't even tell it yet. But see what I'm saying? So there may be levels of torment in hell depending on how bad the person's been and how bad they still are there, and how much they hate being with God. And they might even say, well, I don't like this, just like most people say about their human life. I really don't like the mess I'm in, but I don't want to give my life over to God. I don't think they ever would. I don't think they ever would if they had the opportunity. In fact, there's that story, I don't believe it's a parable, I think it's a story of what really happened, that Jesus gave about the rich man and Lazarus, a different Lazarus. The one had gone to Hades, okay, and the other one is in the bosom of Abraham. And what does the guy that's down there in the fire say? I don't think my brother will like this. So could you see that he gets the gospel? He's not even pleading for himself. See what I'm saying? I would think the first thing I would say to God is, God, can I have one more chance? Please, please, please. Even that story. My brother won't like this, but I wouldn't like being with you. Well, look how vivid that is. You just can't miss the reality of eternal torment, and yet there's a good God behind it, and only He knows how that is going to work out. Okay, the fourth message is in verse 13. Then I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. So the fourth message is, you're going into the Great Tribulation, or you're in it already. Don't be afraid of death. Don't be afraid of being a martyr, because it's going to be a step into the glory that God has waiting for you. And that's the only thing I can imagine that has given this strength of character to the martyrs of our recent years. I used to wonder when I read stories about martyrs, and I still wonder whether I would have the courage to not deny Christ. I mean, that would be the worst thing that I could think about myself, is that I would deny Christ. But I don't know if they're about to chop my head off, or worse yet, burn me at a stake or something like that. Would I have the courage? I hope to believe. Here's the thing. The Lord gives them the courage.
Yes.
Yes.
He takes enough pain away.
Yes.
He takes the fear away. So they just take it, and it really, it upsets the killers that much more. And ISIS in Syria, they went door to door asking, are you a Christian? They could have denied that they were Christian. They probably gave them a chance or two after that to deny Christ, but they didn't. In spite of what's going to happen. This is supernatural. So anyway, this is the fourth message. And then let's just look at verses 19 to 21, the reaping of judgment during the tribulation. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, guess who? With a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. This is not the vision of Christ that we've had before, but we've had previews of it. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle. Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe. The angels swung the sickle on the earth, gathered the grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles, for a distance of 16,000 stadia. 1,600 stadia. This is Armageddon. See how in our chart each chronological section goes up to Armageddon? Well, this is definitely Armageddon. There could only be one of these in human history. You know, it's the bitter end. It's like reaping. When it's time for harvest, you have to do as much of it as you can at once, right? And that's what this picture is. But then, in the case of grapes, the poor grapes, they're not just harvested and have people buy them because they're so beautiful in the store. They're going to be smashed so that they can be turned into grape juice and wine. Okay, so this is this picture. It's a harvest of evil people who are going to be crushed. And the hardest part for me to wrap my head around here is verse 20, where the blood that flows out after they gathered people from all over the world for the Battle of Armageddon. This is more people than you and I can imagine in one place. Filling the whole breadbasket of Israel, preparing for that one battle against Jerusalem, because they knew that the hero of that battle was going to be Jesus, and he's pretty strong, you know, and calling him down out of heaven. We want to do away with you, Jesus. You caused us too much trouble. And so when he comes, it's that sword out of his mouth that we'll read about in Revelation 19 that just kills everybody that's out there. This is the same kind of a picture. But I don't know. Is there enough blood in the world for the literal fulfillment of that? You know, filling a little gully at least, or maybe a deep one, or whatever. You know how far 1,600 stadia is? One stadia is the length of 2 football fields. 1,600 of those, that's a long, long way.
180
Now maybe, I've never seen scientific work on this, maybe there is enough blood in people in the human family to fill that big of a trench. But if not, then there's a lot of symbolic language in Revelation. So I'll just have to wait and see if it's literal or symbolic. Whatever it is, it's the worst. You don't ever want to see anything worse than that.
180 miles.
180 miles? Yeah. Can you imagine that much blood? I don't know. But that'd be about right, though, from the north end of the Valley of Armageddon, or Megiddo, to Jerusalem. So, interesting. Well, let's look at chapter 15. I saw in heaven another great and marvelous sign, 7 angels with the 7 last plagues, because with them God's wrath is completed. And I saw what looked like a sea of glass glowing with fire, and standing beside the sea, those who had been victorious over the beast and its image, and over the number of its name. They held the harps given them by God, and sang the song of God's servant Moses and of the Lamb. And then here's a song right in the middle of Revelation, or past the middle. Great and marvelous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear you, Lord, and bring glory to your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. I love the placement of this song, because we're just recoiling from the Battle of Armageddon. And now, another vision of the Battle of Armageddon is going to be the 7 vials of God's wrath, or bowls, which we'll study next week, the Lord willing. But in the middle of that, it isn't, what an ugly, horrible God to do these kind of things to his creatures. It's more, the time of judgment had to come, because just like in the days of Noah, if God had not cleansed the earth at that time, it wouldn't have lasted much longer anyway. He gave it a fresh start. He has to cleanse it again. Here's a song of the people who know his nature, and they see these things in the vision, and yet they say he's good and he's wonderful and his acts are righteous. And verse 5, and after this I looked and I saw in heaven the temple, that is the tabernacle of the covenant law, and it was opened. Out of the temple came 7 angels with the 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen, and wore golden sashes around their chests. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls filled with the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. Now this temple is definitely not on earth. It's in heaven, it says so. And the temple, first the Lord gave Moses plans for a tabernacle, right? Which was a movable, large tent. Then when Solomon built the temple, it was built on the same pattern, but a different scale. And now there is a temple in heaven, and it's probably been there all along, maybe since Moses, before Moses. But out of it come these 7 angels. They're coming out of a place of great holiness to do something really horrible, just like what we've been reading. But it's going to be a different angle on it now. Armageddon is going to look like the 7 bowls of the wrath of God. Do you remember that I told a story at the beginning that I had used this passage to try to win my junior high school friend to the Lord? What we're going to study next week, don't do it. It's not effective. I think we can conclude there for today.